Hi, and welcome to this webcast about the challenges of reporting and monitoring in the cloud. My name is Michael Van Horenbeeck. I'm an Exchange Server MVP in MCSM, and I work at Enow Software as their Director of Product Research, which means that I'm involved with the development of all their products around Exchange, SharePoint, Link, Active Directory, but also Office 365. Especially Office 365 is becoming more and more important, and this is what this topic today is going to be about my adventures of things that I have seen in Office 365. I've been active in the industry for about 13 years now, and I've been mainly involved with messaging, Exchange, obviously, but also everything that's communications, IT management, and so forth and so on. I do speak at several conferences. I've spoken this year at Connections, TechEd, but you can also find me blogging at vanhybrid.com, and as the name might give away, I'm a little bit biased to everything what's cloud related, hybrid related, because I think this is something that we see today, that a lot of companies go into these converged hybrid infrastructures because it makes most sense for them. But again, let's not discuss this here because we are on a tight schedule and there's a lot of things that I want to talk to you about. Lastly, I'm also a member of the UC Architects. Even though I've not been on the show lately, I do try and contribute wherever possible on this great podcast with like-minded peers all over the world. And the way that I want to handle today's presentation is a little bit different from what you're usually used to. I'm not going to slam you with about 40 slides of bullet points and phrases and a lot of text. I'd rather want to use a tale today. I want to tell a story about a fictive company, and I know it's not very creative, but at least it gives you the idea where I want to go to. And I want to talk about the challenges that this company has encountered on their journey to the cloud. And it all starts with the beginning. The company, which I, funnily enough, called VH Industries, but it could be pretty much any company out there. They decided to move to the cloud, and they made that decision based on a study they conducted, but mainly because one of the sales guys from that cloud vendor came in and they told them, hey, it's a pretty blue sky and, it's a cloudy world and everything is great and you'll have, less servers on premises. It'll be less complex. Overall, you'll just be very happy. Very much like people on a sunny day, they are generally more happy. And the company said, well, it makes sense if we can reduce the amount of servers that we have on premises or reduce the complexity. That actually frees up time to do other stuff or to actually focus on what we're doing instead of managing the IT infrastructure or instead of having to patch all the servers. The whole shebang, you've heard it before. So that's one of the reasons, and I applaud that decision that the company decided to move to the cloud. So they looked forward and they saw a pretty blue sky with some clouds along the way, but they were happy. They knew that they were moving to a better place. And then that's where the journey started. They started moving their assets into Office 365, and let's assume that it's about Office 365 today. And they moved mailboxes, they moved some data in SharePoint, they started using Link, and the users were happy because, Exchange Online is really robust. It's a great system. You can easily, communicate with other people, especially with new features like groups. The company was generally happy with the service they've gotten, and they went on for quite a while. But then, after they have moved to the cloud, they actually saw that it wasn't always what they thought it would be. The cloud sometimes can become a little grumpy in terms of, if you have a slightly clouded sky, it can quickly become quite clouded and it can, become a dark sky as well. And as with all cloud providers, all cloud solutions, things do happen. So while they were going along the way of using the service, they kind of figured out that sometimes things were not as they expected it to be. And I started off with the example of groups in Office 365. Well, I think that is a great example to start with here as well. In terms of the feature that you get is really good. I mean, I love groups. But the problem is that you don't have as much management over these groups as you'd like to. Furthermore, it's enabled by default, which a lot of companies didn't know, or they didn't want that to be enabled by default. So, I mean, I only take a single example out of here, and I don't want to bash groups, definitely not. I just want to point out that sometimes things aren't as they look like, and there are some challenges that you'll have to live with. And then, of course, you know, these challenges can be seen in different ways. One of the ways is complexity. The cloud solution by itself might be a very straightforward thing, and I mean, Exchange Online, using it through your browser or Outlook, is pretty simple. It's still email, you do the things that you're used to, which is awesome. But when you're in a hybrid deployment, for instance, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes, especially from an IT point of view. In terms of connectivity, your users might be connecting all over the place instead of, you know, connecting to your one server, or even if you only have internal users, they will now start using the internet, which is a big unknown. It's an reliable, but, you know, sometimes depending on your location, unreliable part of the communication flow. So there are a lot of things that you have to take into account. And when I do my hybrid sessions, I always tell people, well, it's no longer about that single server or service. It's no longer only about Exchange or only about SharePoint or Link. It is about, you know, all these little bits and pieces coming together. If you do federated logon, so if you're using ADFS, there is that ADFS part that is there. There is DirSync that is in the equation. You've got your Active Directory now into the mix. So it's no longer that single technology. It's an entire set of things that you have to look at. And then when you graph that out, you come to a conclusion where you can see that there is a lot of things that you have to deal with. Maybe a lot of things that span different groups within your organizations, because typically you've got these verticals, you've got a messaging team, you've got an AD team, you've got a networking team, maybe a security team, and now they all have to start working closely together to make that cloud solution work as they expected. And of course, as long as they work, you know, great together, that is awesome, and that shouldn't be much of a problem. It does incur some planning on your side, but at least there are some things that you know are specific to one team or the other team, like managing Exchange Online obviously is going to be for the messaging team. But things become more complicated if problems start arising. And unfortunately, problems do happen. I mean, let's face it, Office 365 isn't a 100% uptime. Amazon Web Services isn't. There is no cloud solution out there which provides a 100% uptime. Maybe the cloud service itself might, you know, be able to offer 100%, even though I find that very unlikely to happen. But as I said, there is more to the story than that. The uptime that they provide to you isn't necessarily the uptime that your users will perceive because of the various elements which I talked about. So let's take an example from the real world. On June 23rd, if I'm correct, of this year, Microsoft had an outage. They had some issues with Mailflow, which was caused by an issue internally in their environment. It had to do with Active Directory, and that, you know, caused quite a lot of grief for users, or their users in I think it was in North America, which is clearly a cloud disaster, right? But, you know, companies that have lived through that problem that day might have had other problems. Maybe they had an internet connection outage, or their hybrid Exchange server, if their hybrid, might have gone down, or they needed some downtime for maintenance. All in all, I mean, there are various reasons why a service might not be working. The problem is, how do you determine what is the cause of a problem? If you are doing maintenance on your end, for instance, patching firewalls, but you don't have the ability to do that online, or you're getting a new connection, or even worse, I had a customer and they had roadworks going on in their street, and then all of a sudden they had no electricity, they had no internet because someone pulled the cable the cables, actually, the networking cables from the street. So the providers, the electricity provider and the telco provider, had to come in and solve the problem, but it took them 3 days to actually get that up and running. Electricity was back after a few hours, but the internet connection, because it was a new fiber that had to be, had to be installed, it took them more than expected. So that company had a 3-day internet outage, and they were able to kind of mitigate that problem by using alternate solutions, by having people work from home. But because they had stuff on premises, they had to deal with that additional complexity, which I really want to focus on today, because imagine that you have a problem. Something is not working. Well, a lot of companies are in the state that they have one big question mark. What is causing the problem? Why is it being caused? Where is the problem? Is it the company internal systems causing issues? Is it maybe a single user affected and having internet connection issues at home when he's working from home? Maybe it is a cloud problem. Maybe there is an outage in Office 365, but the difficulty becomes how to determine where the problem is, when the problem occurred, and basically how to solve the problem. Because if there is a problem in Office 365, then obviously there isn't much that you can do about it, other than communicate to your users that Microsoft is likely to be working on the issue and maybe taking a look at the service dashboard, or calling your TAM or the support guys to make sure that you get some feedback about the issue. But at least it leaves you with a lot of question marks, and if you have a very skilled team, they might be able to find out what's going on. But a lot of customers, and I don't mean that with any disrespect, but a lot of customers struggle with the complexities of these systems, because oftentimes they have a few guys that need to handle multiple technologies. And as I will discuss later, there are a lot more challenges to this problem than what you might think of. And in the end, what happens is that people start troubleshooting, but they find themselves getting caught. They get themselves caught because things are more complex than they actually expected. Maybe users were not able to access their mailboxes. Well, the question is it a connectivity issue? Is it a connectivity issue on your end? Is it a general connectivity issue? Is it an issue on Office 365 end? Or maybe there is no connectivity issue and it's just your ADFS infrastructure being down. But then again, is it down because there is a connectivity issue? Is it your firewall? Is it the ADFS servers? Or maybe if you have installed the ADFS servers externally in a third-party data center, maybe they are having issues. Or if you're using Azure, maybe it's an Azure-only issue. And as you can see, there's a lot of things, a lot of questions to be asked, a lot of things to look at before you can actually figure out where the problem is. And without doing something in terms of monitoring and reporting, it becomes a really heavy burden to maintain that visibility in the environment. You can, hand off the task to one of your admins and tell them, well, there is a problem, go and fix it. And if he's lucky and he just pinpoints the issue by looking at the first thing that he looks at. For instance, your users are not able to authenticate because they get an error message. So the administrator gets the task to solve the problem. He looks at the ADFS server, and it happens to be the ADFS server. Awesome, great. He found the problem, maybe on purpose, or maybe just because that's the first thing he thought of. But at the same time, he could maybe be looking at the ADFS server and trying to figure out if that is working, whereas the problem might not even be caused by the ADFS server. It might have been caused by, as I said earlier, an internet connection issue, firewall, networking device issue, load balancer, or even it could be something in Office 365. So in the end, you don't have any guarantees that the efforts that you're doing to pinpoint the issue, to find the issue, are helping you to quickly troubleshoot and maybe mitigate the problems. On top of that, there is a challenge that even though Microsoft does a really good job at telling people when there is an issue, it isn't something that is updated real time. And I'm talking about the service health dashboard here in Office 365. That's one of the problems that you'll see, is that as soon as you experience a problem, you can actually go to the health dashboard and try and figure out if there's something wrong, but chances are that it takes them a while to update the dashboard. And let's get back to the problem in on June 23rd. It took them a few hours before the dashboard got updated with relevant information where someone could actually figure out whether or not they were affected by a global issue or at least a regional issue in Office 365. So that meant that a lot of companies were in I'd say a foggy zone, in a gray area where they didn't exactly know whether the problem was Office 365 or a problem was caused by them. They probably knew after doing some troubleshooting, after spending some efforts there, that the problem was very likely in Office 365, but unless Microsoft actually confirms the problem in the Service Health dashboard or you talk to some of the support guys, it's very hard to actually know. And that brings me to the next point where just like anything else, it is very important that you try and measure things, that you try and know what is going on, because there is a saying in Belgian, it says, meten is weten, measuring means knowing. So if you measure something, then you know what is going on, which is quite logical. And the same applies to cloud services. Even though that a lot of companies are like, well, we don't need to monitor cloud services because we don't run them, you actually do, because cloud services is one part of the equation, and as I mentioned before, there are a lot of moving parts in there. So again, it is very important to get that information, and there's a lot of information to gather. We will talk about the challenges about how to get the information or what information is visible to you a little bit later in this presentation, but at least know that there is a lot of things that you can do from a client's perspective. Even though that a lot of things are inaccessible, there's a lot of things that you should actually consider. Now, the question here is, how on earth do you start doing that? How do you monitor cloud solutions? Well, it's very similar to how you actually monitor clouds and the weather. You do that by a multi-level approach. You don't do a single thing. You don't just do let's say a connectivity test by pinging outlook.office365.com. That might actually tell you that you're able to make a connection, or at least that there is some network route to Office 365, but it doesn't tell you anything about what the service is doing, or whether or not the service is working. So you need multiple layers of defense, you need multiple approaches. And the way that we do it in Mailscape 365 is we take a look at the Office 365 service at various levels. First of all, there is connectivity. Obviously, that is very important. And connectivity means that you monitor the connection, whether or not the connection succeeds. And you also take a look at how the connection performs. Is it latent in terms of if you have a very, very big pipe to the internet, that is awesome. I mean, your users will be genuinely happy with the service they're getting from Office 365, but it might also be a different problem. Imagine, for instance, that you're using Office 365, but people are complaining about slowness. Well, if you never ever monitor the latency on the connection or even the usage of your connection, then how can you tell them whether or not it's a problem on their end? So again, it's very important to make sure that the connection succeeds, but also important to make sure that you have some sort of baseline. Just like server monitoring, make sure that you know how your internet connection is behaving in normal circumstances, that when users are reporting some slowness, which then adversely affects their end user experience, you can actually go and take a look at the metrics from your internet connection and tell them, oh right, there's someone downloading heaps of data from service X or Y, or there might be a problem with the connection because there isn't much usage, but we see a huge spike in latency. And that brings me to the other problem. That spike in latency, is it something that is caused by your internet connection, or is it maybe something caused at the other end? Again, these are challenges that you'll have to deal with because it might be your internet connection, which then requires you to go and talk to your telco provider. But what if it's Office 365? Then there is obviously nothing much that you can do other than maybe logging a support ticket and letting Microsoft know that they have an issue, even though they probably already do. But that way you'll stay in touch with it. So there is that challenge because how do you monitor Microsoft sides of things? Well, you can monitor the latency on your internet connection, but that only gives you half of the view. So ideally, what you do there is you collect data from different points. And the way that we do it is we also test Office 365 connectivity from a random point on the internet, which then compares the data. And it tells you, well, if your latency is high, but the latency from the other data center is low, then it's very, very likely that it's your internet connection causing issues. Well, your internet connection or your connectivity in general, because it might also be a firewall, but at least it gives you some idea to where you should start looking and not falsely accuse Microsoft of having a slow service. But again, the way that you do that is having those multiple layers, those multiple levels of control and verification. So you do that internally, and you make sure that you have a test from external. And that's how we deal with it in our Mailscape 365 solution. And then you've got everything that is authentication related, because that is more related to the platform. Authentication is important to Exchange, to SharePoint, to Link, obviously. And if you have cloud-only IDs, that's pretty simple. I mean, Microsoft deals with the authentication, and the way that you could test it is maybe do a synthetic transaction and take a user and let it try and log on into Office 365. But as soon as you start using DirSync, that becomes a critical component, especially if you're using password sync, or even if you're using ADFS, then these ADFS servers become a really important part. So again, you need to monitor ADFS not only for uptime, like is the server available, but also can you actually get a token? Are you able to authenticate using ADFS? And then just like with the network connectivity, are your internal users able to do that? And are your external users able to do that? Or maybe users in a remote site, because the way they connect to ADFS might really be different depending on where they are or what application they are using. For instance, if we're taking a look at Microsoft Outlook, Outlook uses a different authentication flow than Outlook Web App, because in Outlook Web App, it's your client itself who makes a connection to the ADFS server, which might be an internal connection to the ADFS server, or it might be over the internet. Really depends on your network topology. But in Outlook, when your user authenticates to Office 365, it's actually Microsoft who is going to contact your ADFS server and try to authenticate the user. So it's going to authenticate on behalf of the user, if you will, which means that your ADFS server needs to be published on the internet, and you know for sure that the connectivity is coming in from the internet. So if you ever end up in the situation where users internally can connect but externally they cannot, it can still be a inbound issue, maybe a reverse proxy issue. It could be an ADFS proxy issue. There's a lot of things there, but at least it gives you the overview that internal users are able to authenticate, but external users aren't. So it's likely that it's not the ADFS server because it's still working for the internal users. It's something in between the external users and the ADFS servers, which could, as I said, end up being a lot of things, but it gives you that more granular idea of where to go and search. Now, there's two more important things, I'd say. There's everything platform related, licensing, remote PowerShell connectivity, where you can do some synthetic transactions to make sure that that works. But let's mainly focus on the features that you're getting, right? You need to make sure that for instance, if you're using Exchange Online, that you can use Exchange Online, that you're able to log on to OA, that you can send a message, that messages are being sent and received, and especially in a hybrid deployment, even more so in a hybrid deployment with centralized mail flow, which means that messages sent from a mailbox in Office 365 will always be routed through the on-premises servers. There it is important that you do a periodical test of that system to make sure that whenever a message is sent, it actually gets sent out to the internet, because it is using that on-premises component. And the reason why it is important that you monitor that is because mail flow, it isn't instant. Even though that some users use it as a sort of IM tool, I get that. They send a message and they expect an immediate reply. Mail delivery isn't instantaneous. There can be a delay. People can, take time to answer to an email. That's just the nature of how it works. But that also causes that when I send off an email and it gets stuck in some queue, I don't immediately notice that. I will notice that when I don't get a reply on that email if I expect a reply within X amount of time, or when I get the delivery status notification telling me that the delivery failed because the message never made it to the other end. But that could take up to 48 hours or even more. It really depends. So again, before any issues are seen, it becomes really important that you know that there is an issue. And what I just called out, the Mailflow issue, isn't a cloud solution only problem. It is a problem in an on-premises messaging solution as well. But if you don't test it, how do you know whether it is broken? Sure, you could rely on your users calling into the help desk, which eventually will happen. They will call the help desk and tell them, hey, I sent this message to person X, but the person X just told me that he never got the email. Could you look into it? But then it's too late. The problem is already there. The problem might already be really huge. If you have vast amounts of data that you're sending through email, then obviously you're too late. You should try and tackle it early on before it becomes a problem. Again, if the problem is caused by Office 365, like the June outage, which we talked about before, then unfortunately, there's nothing much that you can do, but at least you can communicate very well to your end users. And that is at least as important as being able to troubleshoot correctly if the problem is on your end. Now, all of this adds up to the fact that it is a bumpy road. It isn't as perfect as you would like to. It isn't always as easy as it sounds like, because as I said earlier, sometimes you just need to do some synthetic transactions. Great, but that requires some coding skills. That's why you have third-party solutions like eNow that offer solutions that can do the monitoring for you. But still, there are some challenges that you will see. And these challenges are what I'm going to talk about now. These challenges are very important in terms of monitoring, reporting, especially in larger environments. And it all starts with the fact that you only see half of what's there. Microsoft's infrastructure is completely oblivious to you. You can't see anything. It's their end. And you should not care about how their infrastructure is doing. For all I know, or for all I care, they might have a data center outage. As long as it doesn't impact my users, I don't care. They can have the disk space issues they want as much as they want, as long as my service is up and running and my users can email or upload their documents to SkyDrive or OneDrive, or they can continue using whatever service I bought from Microsoft. I'm okay with it. But it still means that I need to check these functionalities, which I previously mentioned. And in terms of ADFS, that becomes a problem, because if you're troubleshooting ADFS, you only see half of the ADFS flow. You see the flow on your end. If you're troubleshooting Mailflow, you can't see Microsoft server queues. You can't do a get queue and then see if there is a queue building up. So that makes it really challenging to what you can and cannot do, or what you should and shouldn't be doing. So the focus here isn't as much as in the on-premises world to monitoring individual server components. It's more about the end user experience, the ability to use a service, which is really important to you. And the problem with only seeing half of what's there is tightly related to some of the other problems that you see when dealing with cloud services, or in this case, when dealing with Office 365, because very much like the Chinese wall is built to keep strangers out. Microsoft built a wall around their infrastructure to protect it from threats from externally, which means there are multiple layers of defense against all sorts of attacks. But they also need to maintain the integrity of their infrastructure, which means that they have put in place specific countermeasures. And one of these countermeasures is one that you will hit if you are a large company. Well, even if you're a small company, you might hit that. And it's called throttling. Throttling means that Microsoft only allows a specific customer / a specific user to do a specific amount of tasks in a specific amount of time. I know it's a little bit vague, but let me elaborate on this a little bit more. So if you are a single mail user and you are trying to get some data through PowerShell, for instance, you're querying all the ActiveSync devices. In a 10-user company, it's very likely that you'll get back your data within a few seconds with all the information that you need, no problems asked. You can probably run the report a few times an hour and get updated information like mailbox statistics or ActiveSync device statistics, anything that you want to have without any issues. Now, try and figure out how that would work if you're a 10,000 seat customer, right? If you want to pull in the ActiveSync device statistics, you might actually be trying to pull in data for 15,000 devices, which means that there's a lot of querying going on the back end. So obviously, you're not the only 10K customer in Office 365. There are a lot of customers, a lot of larger customers too in Office 365. So what Microsoft does, similarly to how you would do it on premises, they implement throttling policies which prevent a specific customer, so any given customer, to use more resources on the system than what they actually should be using. And the way and why they do that is to make sure that every customer on the same set of shared servers can use this, can expect the same performance of the system. So me as a single customer, I would never be able to put such a load on the system, causing problems for other people, which in a shared infrastructure is logical. I mean, I can applaud that Microsoft has these kind of throttling policies, because I wouldn't be able to, I wouldn't want to be inadvertently be affected by some customer running some reports on their tenant. But at the same time, if I'm that customer who wants to do reporting and I'm getting delays, I'm getting throttles, that might actually start hurting me, because I want to have my data. I want to know what is going on in the environment. And that's one of the biggest challenges. The default throttling policies, even though Microsoft doesn't really expose them, so they don't tell you exactly what the throttling settings are, they're okay. You can get a list of all the devices. You can get a list of all the mailboxes. But it becomes more interesting or more of a problem when you're trying to get statistics. So for a 10K company or even a 20K company, if you want to get mailbox statistics, or let's even dive in a little bit further, if you want to do the get mailbox folder statistics, then you want to know where data is stored in user mailboxes. And that's a legitimate ask. I mean, it's very interesting to know from a usability point of view, from reporting purposes, to know where data is stored in mailboxes. Or if you want to have ActiveSync device statistics, knowing how many devices are being used, what load they're causing, what kind of devices are being used, what operating systems are on these devices, from an IT management purpose, that is really useful information. So again, if you start pulling in that data, then you're pulling in vast amount of data, and the problem is that instead of getting the results in an hour, you might be waiting multiple hours. But obviously, these aren't the only reports that you want to pull in. If we take a look at the most commonly used reports, device reports, mailbox reports, message tracking reports in Office 365, if you start querying the service multiple times an hour for specific information, or even if you do that consecutively. So imagine that you start querying the ActiveSync device statistics, and that takes 6 hours to complete because of the vast amount of data and the throttling that is implemented. Then immediately afterwards, you want to start pulling in the data for the mailbox statistics, because you want to get that every 24 hours. You actually end up in a sort of loop where you will get queued and queued and queued, and that might eventually lead up to the account being blocked from connecting to the service because it exceeded its throttling limits. Now, the challenge here is, how do you go about this? Well, there are many ways that you can do that. First of all, what you could do as a very large customer is you could talk to Microsoft and see if you can get those throttling limits increased. I don't think it's publicly known, and I'm not sure if you can do that, because obviously there are some risks there, but that's something that I would do. I would go and talk to Microsoft and tell them, hey, you know what, I need this kind of information. Can you maybe make some changes here or there? But before I would do that, I would actually go in and then try something else. I would actually go in and use multiple accounts, because throttling policies are obviously on a per tenant basis, but more importantly, they're also on a per account basis. So if you use one account to get the mailbox statistics, then you could use a different admin account to get the active sync device statistics. And the benefit that you get there is that you don't eat away all the throttling resources that you have, or all the credits you have, I'd say, on one account. You spread them across two accounts. But obviously, the risk there is if you use too many of those credits on both accounts, you end up maybe locking out both of them. So it is a very difficult exercise, and there's no way telling up front whether or not you'll get throttled. So I had a customer not so long ago that tried querying 25,000 seats for active sync device statistics, and it took them 14 hours to get the data. Well, add those 14 hours in a 24-hour time frame, and then obviously you see that something isn't working. So as a customer, you can go about it in different ways. You can schedule a report only once a week instead of every day. As I said, you can go and talk to Microsoft. You can be selective about for whom you get the data. So instead of getting the active sync device statistics for everyone, maybe just target a subset of users. But more importantly is you should also try and take a look at how you can get data out of the service. So in Office 365, there are many different ways that you can do that. First of all, there are some built-in reports in the Office 365 portal, which are basic, but they can provide you with the information that you're looking for, which obviously helps you because you don't need to do the querying. Secondly, there's PowerShell, which we discussed at length. But thirdly, there's also the reporting REST APIs that you can use. So Microsoft has a reporting web service, which they released quite a while back, but they're continuously improving these web services. And even though these web services are obviously throttled as well, they are very powerful in terms of what data you can get. So the way that it works, and let's use an example to kind of illustrate that, is if you want to know the top 10 biggest mailboxes in Office 365, who are your biggest data hogs, even though you're not using any disk space for the mailboxes on a server, that's Microsoft's problem, but they're still using disk space on their computer, or you just are interested in who has the biggest mailbox. Well, then you would get the mailbox statistics, so the mailbox sizes for all mailboxes in your environment, and then you would just take a list of top 10, the top 10 list from that, right? But the problem here is that you first had to query all the mailboxes, adding up to that limit that we discussed. Using the REST APIs, you can actually query just for the top 10 mailboxes, which in turn would just return 10 results instead of 1,000 results that you have to filter out yourself. So it's for some of the things that you can do, definitely much better, much faster. Unfortunately, today, these REST APIs, these services are limited in terms of what you can do. So for instance, these active sync device statistics, which I discussed earlier, they are not available through the REST APIs. But mailbox sizes, or actually the top 20 users and stuff, these are all available. Another thing that you will see in Office 365 is message tracing. They have message tracings available for the past 30 days. But sometimes customers want more. So another challenge that you have there is, what do you do if you want to keep 60 days? Because you're legally bound to having 60 days? Well, the best way to do that is query the data through web services or through PowerShell, and then store them maybe on a database locally. That's how we do it in Mailscape 365, and then allow you to go through the data over a longer period of time. But again, that is the challenge that you will face with most of the cloud services, is that they need to maintain a balance between the services that they offer, the integrity of their system, so that they don't jeopardize their infrastructure because of the needs of a single customer. So even though Office 365 is not a pure one-size-fits-all, there are some downsides to the fact that it is a shared service where you as a customer need to architect around. obviously, and luckily, there are options like using multiple accounts or spreading the load across several hours or maybe several days, decreasing the frequency of several reports, but it's still something that you will have to deal with. And for that matter, it doesn't only apply to when you're trying to do reporting. If you're doing mass updates, so for instance, a get mailbox and set mailbox because you're changing an attribute, well, if you're doing that on a large amount of data, then you'll definitely get throttle as well, because changing attributes on a mailbox, for instance, is a destructive command, which means that it takes more resources than maybe just querying, and as a result, you will see that you'll get these micro delays when you issue such a command. Luckily, it isn't something that you should be doing every day, but at least you know that what you can expect. Now, this being said, let's take a short look at what we do at eNow. As I said, we have various solutions, and one of them is Mailscape 365, which addresses a lot of the things that I talked about today. We have, or we try as a company to work as much as possible with Microsoft to work around some of the limitations, even though there's nothing much that we or Microsoft can do about certain things today. But at least we allow you to have multiple accounts in Mailscape 365, and we make sure that we are as comprehensive as possible by telling you if there is a problem, whether it was on your end, whether it was on Microsoft's end, and making sure that we make a distinction between ADFS, DirSync, your on-premises functionality tests, or maybe the cloud functionality test, and also make a distinction between whether it's your end, Microsoft end, or a remote end, maybe a remote site that you're managing. So feel free to download a trial for Mailscape 365 and let us know what you think. This being said, I thank you very much for your interest today. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them, and I'll make sure to get back to you with these answers. Thanks.